In June of 1941, the Soviet Union, reeling in chaos and fear, steeled itself for impact as Nazi Germany unleashed the ferocious Operation Barbarossa. Having swiftly conquered much of Europe, Germany's vast panzer formations rolled east with the clear objective of crushing any Soviet defense on their way to conquering Moscow. In the midst of the wider invasion, Soviet General Mikhail Kirponos launched a desperate counteroffensive against the encroaching 1st Panzer Group advancing toward Kyiv. The impending battle was a tumultuous fray that would engage over 2,600 Soviet tanks against nearly 1,000 German tanks. The Soviets held a numerical edge, bolstered by many of the heavier KV and T-34 tanks, which were superior to anything in the German arsenal at the time. However, the 6 Soviet corps were mired in disorganization, suffering from a severe shortage of trucks and tractors essential for deploying battlefield logistics. They were all converging near the town of Brody for a brutally intense mechanized showdown. It was a clash of raw numbers against meticulous strategy and unyielding execution. For the Soviets, their very existence hung in the balance. Vast tank formations, extending as far as the eye could see, hurtled into battle. David Glantz, a historian of the Eastern Front and Soviet military, boldly declared about the Battle of Brody, quote, "This, in fact, is the biggest tank battle in World War II. The moment Adolf Hitler and his high command had meticulously planned for months arrived at the dawn of Sunday, June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa signaled the commencement of one of history's most colossal military campaigns. Encompassing about 80% of the Axis's combat-ready forces, over 3.5 million troops surged across the Soviet border. The invasion spanned an astounding 1,800-mile front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In a stunning miscalculation, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin dismissed multiple warnings about the impending attack. Stalin's trust in the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, inked less than 2 years earlier with Hitler, left the Red Army largely unprepared and without a coordinated defense strategy against the Nazi onslaught. Wehrmacht soldier Gerhard Goertz vividly described the chaos as his unit thrust into Soviet territory. Quote, "Some of them even came out in their nightshirts and opened fire. They were taken completely by surprise." German propaganda framed the invasion as a preemptive action against a looming Soviet attack. However, Hitler's true motive was to annihilate a daunting adversary and seize Lebensraum, living space for the German people. His vision stretched the German Reich from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. The initial phase of the invasion saw significant German victories, capturing key Soviet territories and inflicting heavy casualties. However, Hitler made a strategic decision to delay the attack on Moscow, focusing instead on Ukraine in the south. This decision was influenced by the need to secure Ukraine's resources and the belief that capturing Moscow would not necessarily lead to the collapse of Soviet resistance. The delay allowed the Soviets to strengthen their defenses, particularly around Moscow, and prepare for the harsh winter conditions. As the Germans' formations thrust into Ukraine, the Soviet troops around the towns of Dubno, Lutsk and Brody faced a ferocious onslaught from the freshly arrived Nazi forces. Despite their lack of preparation and disarray, the Soviet soldiers were determined to defend their homeland to the last man. The terrain around Brody in 1941 was ill-equipped for vehicular movement, especially for the demands of tank warfare. Apart from a few narrow, inadequately maintained highways, movement was primarily confined to dirt roads meandering through a landscape marked by forests, hills, small marshy rivers and swamps. Yet during the first week of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, this roughly triangular area, enclosed by the cities of Lutsk, Rivne and Brody, would transform into the backdrop for the most catastrophic armored confrontation on the Eastern Front. Panzer Group 1, the vanguard of the German Army Group South, pierced the Soviet defenses near the border town of Vladimir-Volynski on June 22, 1941. This adept tactical maneuver created a 40-kilometer breach through which the Wehrmacht troops surged into Soviet lands. The Soviet Fifth Army, under Major General M.I. Potapov, faced the full force of this charge, struggling valiantly to stem the German advance. The Germans aimed for a swift push towards the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, intending to capture it and reach the Dnieper River just beyond. With this objective achieved, their forces planned to veer south along the river, ensnaring most of the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts. The seizure of Lutsk, a crucial junction, would allow German mobile units to break into open ground, advancing along dual axes towards Kyiv. The German advance was relentless and seemingly unstoppable. The Soviet High Command, still grappling with the reality of the German invasion, failed to establish an effective defensive strategy in the initial days of the conflict. As the first day of warfare drew to a close, Lieutenant General Mikhail Kirponos, commanding the southwestern front, was besieged with orders from the Soviet National Defense Committee. The directive was clear yet daunting: counterattack towards Vladimir Volinsky immediately, annihilate the German forces operating from that region, and seize the city of Lublin by the end of June 24th. This command seemed preposterous. Lublin lay over 80 kilometers deep in German-occupied Poland. This reality led General Kirponos to question whether the Soviet High Command truly grasped the gravity of the situation at the border, or if they were simply attempting to mollify Stalin's fury. Despite recognizing the mission's futility, Kirponos had no choice but to comply. He faced a dual dilemma. The Soviet defensive line was already teetering, and the 5 mechanized corps designated for the counteroffensive were dispersed across northwestern Ukraine. In stark contrast to the Germans' potent and concentrated mechanized spearhead, Kirponos had a more significant yet fragmented and diminished force at his disposal. Assembling this force would take up to 3 days, causing a critical delay in a rapidly evolving battlefield. Consequently, each of the 5 mechanized corps was thrust into battle in a fragmented manner with little to no coordination. This disjointed approach directly resulted from the rigid timeline, which left Kirponos with inadequate time to amass and properly strategize for the counteroffensive. Yet the numerical strength of the Soviet forces could not be understated. An overwhelming mass of tanks surged towards the German 1st Panzer Group, an assault involving over 3,000 Soviet armored vehicles navigating the rugged Ukrainian landscape. However, despite facing only half the number of operational tanks as the Soviets, the Germans held a significant tactical advantage. As the Soviet mechanized units began their advance towards the border, they were met with the fury of the German Luftwaffe. Air raids pummeled the Soviet armored columns, strung out vulnerably along the narrow roads. Soviet drivers, in a frantic bid for cover, often found themselves mired in the challenging terrain. Many were forced to abandon or destroy their own vehicles, fearing capture by German forces. The attrition rate of the Soviet armored vehicles, already hampered by poor maintenance, escalated to alarming levels. The combination of losses from Luftwaffe strikes and mechanical failures meant that some Soviet tank formations entered the fray with less than half their operational strength. On the afternoon of June 24th, the beleaguered 19th Tank Division of the 22nd Mechanized Corps clashed with German forces west of Lutsk. A provisional regiment was formed with 45 T-26 tanks, along with a dozen armored cars. This makeshift unit was thrust into the fray following a brief preparatory artillery bombardment. The Soviet forces found themselves ensnared in a lethal trap. They became easy targets for the agile and heavily armed German aircraft in their urgent push toward their objective across the perilous landscape. If the Luftwaffe's strikes didn't cripple the Soviet tanks, then a lack of maintenance, oil shortages, and mechanical defects surely would. Yet amidst this turmoil, the Soviets persevered. Manning their faltering tanks, they engaged the enemy. The provisional Soviet regiment entered a brutal tug-of-war with German 14th Panzer Division elements. This intense battle, lasting 2 hours, saw the Soviet unit suffer heavy losses of its already diminished armored contingent. Ultimately, overwhelmed and battered, the regiment was compelled to retreat, falling back nearly 15 kilometers west of Lutsk. The clash was a relentless and indiscriminate slaughter. Major General S.M. Kondrusev, the commander of the 22nd Mechanized Corps, fell in action, and the commander of the 19th Tank Division sustained injuries. The toll was equally severe among the division's regimental commanders, who either perished or were wounded. Despite the devastating losses, the Soviets' fierce resistance was not futile. They inflicted heavy casualties and, through sheer tenacity, stopped the 14th Panzer Division from capturing Lutsk. Throughout the night between June 24th and 25th, the 22nd Mechanized Corps arrived with 2 divisions to reinforce the beleaguered remnants of the 19th Tank Division. Faced with acute fuel shortages, the Soviet officers resorted to makeshift solutions by siphoning fuel from disabled vehicles and redistributing it to those still operational. Before the invasion rattled the USSR, its military had an impressive fleet of nearly 20,000 tanks, predominantly light tanks. Additionally, the Red Army had at its disposal a handful of modern tanks that were technically superior to their German counterparts. Among these was the T-34, a medium-sized tank outfitted with a devastating 76.2mm gun, featuring 60-degree sloped armor, significantly enhancing its defensive capabilities against anti-tank fire. Another standout was the Kliment Voroshilov KV-1 heavy tank, lauded for its robust armor protection and a top speed of 17 miles per hour, remarkable for its size and class. However, despite these advancements, the bulk of the Soviet tank force was still composed of the T-26 and BT-7 light tanks. While numerous, these bore a critical flaw. Their frontal armor provided minimal defense against the potent German anti-tank weaponry. Compounding this vulnerability was a design issue in Soviet ammunition. Their shells tended to shatter upon impact, rendering them ineffective at penetrating enemy armor. This combination of shortcomings left the Soviet tanks perilously exposed in the face of the German military's advanced armaments. The German forces leveraged the speed and agility of their armored units, augmented by air superiority, to encircle and systematically dismantle Soviet resistance. Their strategy was marked by cohesion and superior communication, crucial for the synchronization of their assaults and for adapting swiftly to Soviet maneuvers. Their aerial dominance of the Luftwaffe not only disrupted Soviet troop movements, but also proved devastating to the massive Soviet armored formations. The Soviet Air Force was also dealt a severe blow. The majority of its aircraft were damaged on the first day of the invasion, and it struggled to provide any substantial support. The Luftwaffe's dominance hopelessly outclassed the few remaining Soviet aircraft dispatched for assistance. This German air superiority not only stymied Soviet reconnaissance, leaving commanders blind to the swiftly changing battlefield dynamics, but also effectively severed the ground forces from essential resupplies of fuel and ammunition. As the aerial engagements grew more fierce, the Soviets sustained additional losses in aircraft and personnel. The Luftwaffe's unceasing assault significantly undermined the Soviet counteroffensive. This chaotic situation reached its peak with the failure of the Soviet counterattack to assemble at the intended rendezvous point in Dubno. The absence of coordination among the different units derailed their efforts to thwart the German onslaught. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Soviets fiercely contested every inch of their territory. In a notable encounter during the battle, the Germans, methodically overpowering the Soviets' lighter T-26 and BT tanks, encountered a group of the fearsome Red Army KV-2 heavy tanks. The German shells were largely ineffective against the KV-2's massive boxy turrets, which boasted thick armor that could deflect incoming fire. When the KV-2S employed their powerful 152 mm howitzers, they momentarily stalled the German advance, showcasing their overwhelming firepower. However, the Germans soon realized that patience was their best tactic against these colossal machines. They strategically waited for the Soviet tanks to deplete their ammunition and fuel reserves. In one instance, the crew of a KV-2, faced with a jammed turret ring, dwindling ammunition, and near-empty fuel tank, chose a dramatic exit by driving their tank off a steep embankment into a river, the driver escaping at the last second. Primarily designed as self-propelled artillery, the KV-2S, despite their intimidating presence, were too few in number to significantly alter the overall course of the battle. Though momentarily disruptive, their impact was ultimately a minor local setback for the German panzer divisions. The Germans, adept in the art of warfare, swiftly adapted their tactics to counter the threat posed by the superior Soviet tanks. Their panzers deftly avoided direct confrontations with the T-34S and KV-2S, instead focusing on eliminating the more vulnerable BT-57S and T-26S. By benefiting from its mobility, German field artillery played a crucial close support role, absorbing the brunt of Soviet tank assaults. After dealing with the lighter Soviet tanks, the German Panzerkampfwagen, the 3s and the 4s, would regroup to target the T-34S and KV-1S from their weaker sides and rear. This tactic effectively neutralized the advantage of the Soviet tanks' heavier frontal armor. The inexperience of Soviet tank drivers often led them to choose the most straightforward paths, even when these routes made them more vulnerable to enemy fire. Navigating their tanks along the crests of ridges or hills was a common mistake which made them highly visible and accessible targets for German gunners. As the day waned, the situation around Lutsk reached a critical juncture. Illuminated by the flames engulfing the surrounding suburbs, the 13th Panzer Division, executing a successful flank maneuver, penetrated the city's defenses. This breakthrough forced the Soviet units to abandon Lutsk. Despite their eventual retreat, the determined resistance of the 22nd Mechanized Corps was not in vain. Their staunch defense delayed the progress of 2 German corps for over a day. The Soviet 9th Mechanized Corps seized this opportunity to reach and set up defenses in the Rivne area, some 65 kilometers east of Lutsk. The plight of the Fifth Army was rapidly deteriorating into a calamity. Its units, dispersed and encircled, were engaged in desperate battles, stretching from the border to Lutsk. In disarray, the remnants of the 22nd Mechanized Corps retreated along the highway towards Rivne, spreading panic in their wake. Only with the direct intervention of staff officers from the Fifth Army's headquarters was some semblance of order restored. On June 26th, German forces launched vigorous assaults along the Lutsk-Rivne and Dubno-Rivne highways, attempting to break into the city. However, they were met with tenacious resistance from the Fifth Army, which stymied their advance. Consequently, the Germans redirected their efforts south, taking secondary roads via the town of Ostrog. The day also witnessed a bold Soviet counteroffensive, marking the closest point the Soviets came to encircling a significant portion of the German invasion force. This fierce Soviet assault disrupted several German support units and penetrated as much as 30 kilometers into territory held by the Germans. The Soviet 43rd Tank Division, leading the charge, reached the eastern outskirts of Dubno. However, the division, primarily composed of light T-26 tanks, suffered severe losses due to the effective German anti-tank artillery. The German commanders swiftly responded to the escalating threat posed by the Soviet counteroffensive. They executed a counterattack against the 2 Soviet tank divisions that had dangerously overextended themselves into enemy territory. These divisions were trapped, wedged between the relentless pressure of 2 German infantry divisions and the onslaught of 2 panzer divisions. Major General Feklenko, who was leading the Soviet attack, recognized the perilous position of his forces. Faced with the German counterattack's overwhelming might, he decided to order his corps to retreat to their original positions near Rivne. This maneuver aimed to preserve the remaining strength of his units and avoid potential encirclement and destruction at the hands of the German forces. By June 28th and 29, the Soviet position in the Battle of Brody deteriorated rapidly. The German tanks, advancing with unyielding efficiency, encircled and obliterated Soviet units, overwhelming many and isolating others. Despite their staunch defense, the Soviet forces were severely impeded by an acute shortage of fuel and ammunition, leading to a catastrophic failure of their left flank by July 1st. With the capture of Ostrog, the battle for the Bloody Triangle effectively ended. The battered Soviet units managed to maintain their position at the Gorin River until July 2nd, but were eventually compelled to retreat further. By July 7th, the 5 Soviet mechanized corps that had engaged in the battle could muster only 679 tanks from their pre-war strength of 3,140. Although the Soviet Fifth Army was heavily depleted, it was not entirely defeated. Despite suffering severe casualties, most of its combat units were not annihilated. Even though the Soviets inflicted considerable losses on the German forces and held numerical superiority, they were consistently outflanked and outmaneuvered. The Red Army lost at least 2,280 tanks, 42% of its initial strength for the southwestern front. The harsh winter that followed began to drastically affect the German forces. The Luftwaffe and other German equipment, including artillery and radios, faced operational challenges due to the lack of suitable oils and lubricants for the cold conditions. The plummeting temperatures led to widespread frostbite among the Nazi troops, hampering their combat capabilities. On the other side, the Red Army endured despite enduring over 3 million casualties inflicted by the Germans. Accustomed to the severe Russian winters and supported by a vast reserve of manpower, the Soviet infantry remained resilient. They continually replenished their ranks, maintaining a solid presence on the Eastern Front against the German forces. Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's grand scheme to invade the Soviet Union, ultimately stretched the German forces to their breaking point. By December 5th, the unyielding resistance of the Soviets had morphed into a remarkable counteroffensive, forcing the Germans into a strategic withdrawal. After a grueling 5 months, 1 week and 6 days, Hitler's rigid command to hold every inch of ground at any cost culminated in a costly failure for the Axis powers.